but not all of us are completely familiar with. So once again, I'm going to read it again from Luke chapter 10, starting at verse 38. Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. And she had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she went up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will never be taken from her. So who are you? Who are you in the story? Are you Mary or are you Martha? Are you someone who is capable of being at rest with the Lord, or are you a doer? Are you someone who's consumed by work and accomplishing everything? Who are you in the story? Are you a doer like Martha, or have you become a person who is able to rest in the presence of the words of Jesus? It's true. This story is about our invitation to be more like Mary. But I doubt it's for the reasons you think. I doubt it's for the reasons that many of us have made this out to be, this text. First things first, Martha isn't wrong. Martha isn't wrong for being wrapped up in serving. She is being hospitable to Jesus. That's not a bad thing. Earlier in chapter 10, when Jesus sent out the 72 to proclaim the peace of God and the kingdom of Jesus to everyone, Jesus identifies hospitality as the sign that the message that his message is being received in that town. And even earlier in Luke chapter 4, 38 to 39, Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law, and she immediately gets up and begins to serve Jesus and his disciples. And Jesus doesn't rebuke her for that. And finally, in our text for today, after Martha's frustration has reached its boiling point that her sister is not helping her prepare this meal for Jesus and the disciples, Jesus doesn't rebuke her either. Jesus doesn't rebuke Martha. Rather, Jesus lovingly invites Martha to put down the serving spoons, take off her apron, to join her sister. Jesus' words, Martha, Martha, is a sign of compassion and mercy. It's not a voice, a proclamation, a sound, a declaration of rebuke. Hospitality and service are not bad. And being a doer is not wrong. So then what's the point of this story? And why and how are we being invited to be more like Mary? Well, Luke tells us at the beginning of the book, at the beginning of this book that he writes, why he writes it. And it's the biggest clue to help us read the rest of the book. In Luke chapter 1, verses 3 to 4, he says this, "It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past." In other words, having witnessed many of the events that occurred in this book, to write an orderly account of these things for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. This guy, Theophilus, was a young catechumen. He was a young student of the faith, and Luke is writing this book, the book of Luke, with a very specific type of person in mind, someone who is learning what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Much like Aiden is, as we've begun confirmation with him. Luke wants to communicate something very specific with Theophilus through this book, through this specific story. Luke wants this young man to understand what it means to follow Jesus, as well as how to follow him. Except for maybe the first half of the 21st century in America, the way of Jesus has always been countercultural. It's always been at odds with the world. It's been a faith of peace and hope and joy in the face of pain, trouble, and persecution. It's a relationship that places emphasis on neighbors rather than oneself. It's a walk that puts us at odds with the way that the world tells us we need to live. While the culture says and yells, do more, be better, Christianity is a movement that proclaims, be still. Be still. Be at rest. The Christian walk is not in line with the world, especially this community. Especially the community in which we live, this Silicon Valley, where the pace is absurd. I'm not sure about you, but a culture of doing more is a culture of anxiety and stress. A culture like this one is a culture that really only breeds anxiety and stress. And I have a way to prove that to you. How many of you have experienced a moment of anxiety or stress in the last week? Anybody? How about the last month? Anybody? Anxiety or stress in the last? Yeah. It's like, duh, Pastor. You're not telling me anything new. But what causes that in us? What causes that in us? I think it's hard for us to get through a day anymore without a moment of anxiety or trouble, without thinking we're not doing enough. The demand of this world, this culture, this area, this place on us is so terribly high, and yet has become normative. It's become an expectation that you never stop moving. I'm convinced that rest, that Sabbath, that being at peace, just being still, has become impossible for many of us. Not only because of the amount of work that is placed upon us, but that we ourselves are incapable of that. I'm going to ask you to do another thing. Raise your hand if you've had a completely rest-filled day in the past month. I'm not raising my hand because I'm one of those people. Oh, Anna, okay. Yeah, thank you. And maybe Lucas. Maybe Lucas. No, I haven't either. I've noticed in myself that if I take a day and read or go for a walk, a hike, or play around at golf, that I have to offset it with finishing something, with completing a task, with checking something off my to-do list. And if I don't do that, I start to feel anxious. I start to feel troubled and worried and burdened. If you're not working, if you're not doing, moving, or accomplishing, if I'm not, then I'm feeling, and I feel as if I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing. If there are days when I don't get anything done, if there are days when I haven't accomplished something big or significant in my eyes, then I don't feel like I'm supposed to be doing what I'm doing. I'm not being an effective human being. Is that the same for you? Is that the same way you feel on a day of rest? That you just can't. We've become so accustomed to working, to doing that we've lost our ability to be. In other words, we've been trained to just keep going. At all stakes, at all cost, no matter what we have to sacrifice, we just have to keep going. Now, Jesus followers, we know that things in the future are taken care of, right? We know that salvation has been won, that Jesus has promised us a place with Him someday, but today it's up to us, right? Today it feels as if it's up to you and me. It's on me to make the world a better place, to become the best and greatest version of myself, to become what my parents and what the people around me, my teachers and my mentors desire me to be. Have you become that person too? Who knows the promises of Jesus, but the reality of them today we forget about. That you forget that Jesus is still at work today for you. Because I frequently forget that. Anxiety and stress, well, they come from a belief ultimately that everything's on me. That everything is up to me. Everything. That I have to carry the weight of the world on my own shoulders. So who are you in the story? Are you more like Mary? Or are you more like Martha? Do you believe that you need to become more like Mary? That you need to work towards that? Is that how you read this story? That we must do our best to try our hardest to be more restful in the world? Is that how you read this story? That you're more like Martha and you know you are, and it's going to take you a lot of work to become more like Mary? That we must wake up every morning and diligently read our Bibles and pray and do meditation or yoga so that we become more restful. That we must force ourselves to rest because that's the type of life Jesus wants from us. Is that how we read this story? I would say that that's completely wrong. And yet we read it that way. We see ourselves as Martha, and we know we need to be more like Mary, and so we put the work on ourselves to become more like Mary, to become more restful and at peace and just being able to be still. When we read this story as if it's primarily about us, though, we inadvertently ask the wrong question. We asked actually the same question that the lawyer asks just a few verses earlier. The question of, what must I do to inherit eternal life? The thing is, from that point on that the lawyers asked that question, Luke and Jesus have been attempting to reverse our logic, to reverse the way we think. The question has never been, what must I do? That's never been the question. Or how much do I have to do to gain more of God's approval and love? The question has never been, what must I do? The question has always been, what has Jesus come to do for me? That is the point of the Gospels. That's the point of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and actually the entirety of the Scriptures. The question that we ask ourselves as we read the Scripture isn't, what must I do? It's, what has Jesus come to do for me? That's a gospel question. That's a question of good news. That's a question at the core of the Christian faith. That's the question Jesus is answering through the story of the Good Samaritan as he casts himself as the Samaritan neighbor who comes to bandage the wounds and carry this beaten, broken man off to safety and to pay the price on his behalf. And it's the same question he's answering for Martha, who's consumed with trying to serve Jesus, to serve God. Jesus answers the question in this way: I have not come to be served, but to serve, and to give my life as a ransom for many. We cause a lot of confusion in our lives, anxiety and trouble and stress, when we believe that the Bible, the way of Jesus, is about what we're supposed to do, rather than about what God, through Jesus, has already done for us. When we think we must first do, prove, chase, rather than the truth of the Scriptures that Jesus has come to do, show, give, and serve, we mix up God's intention for our life. We mix up the purpose of Jesus. Jesus did not come to give us more things to do, but to accomplish the things that we couldn't do from the beginning. I've been slowly working my way through a book. It's called Sabbath Keeping. It's not a perfect book, but it's been helpful in helping me realize my tendency to be consumed in work. And while reading that book and attempting to practice Sabbath, rest, a day of rest, I've learned three very important things. It goes against every bone in my body to rest. 2, our culture is not structured for a weekly rest because I constantly have to change my Sabbath day. It just doesn't fit. And I need rest. I need quality, godly rest in my life. We're not meant to run a race. We're not meant to live life with an empty tank. That's not God's intention for you. Jesus knows how burdensome this world is. He knows its demands. He's felt its pressures. He sees how it breaks us. And He did not come to add to it. He came to free us from it. And just as Jesus has compassion on Martha, who is striving to serve Him, Jesus also has compassion on you and me. When He says, "Take up my yoke, for it is easy and it is light." When He says in Revelation that it's done, it's finished. When He says, "Come to me and I will give you rest." And finally, as He's hanging dead on a cross, it is finished. In Jesus, there is no demand placed upon us in order to receive the compassion and love Jesus has to offer. That's what Jesus, God Himself, has come to do for you, to show compassion and to show love on people who are burdened by the world. This story of Mary and Martha is not about us figuring out who we're supposed to be. It's a story about who Jesus is. Who Jesus is for you and why He came. A God who has come to serve, a God who has come to give Himself and all the gifts of heaven that come with Him. A God who descends to us, not with a scepter and a whip, but with a towel wrapped around His waist, ready to wash nasty feet of men who don't believe in Him. We have a God who has come to serve. Now open up your hymnals for a second. I should have saved the page, but I didn't. To page 151. When someone gets there, what does it say at the top of the page? Divine service. Today, here in this place, who is serving who? Today in this place, as we gather around the Word and around the sacrament of the altar, who is serving who? The divine is serving you. God comes to us today in this service of word and sacrament, of the proclaimed promises of God, and God serves you. An extremely scandalous message of the world that the Creator of all things would come down to you and serve you here. And actually, there are many faiths in the world that say that that's completely offensive and wrong, and yet we read here in Luke 10:38 to 42 that that's exactly what Jesus came to do. To serve you and to serve me. Today, it's not about choosing who you are, Mary or Martha. You are Mary today. Because you have come here to be served by God Himself. You have come to this place to sit at the feet of Jesus, being reassured of your identity as God's beloved, being served His Word through the proclaimed Word that Samantha shared earlier, and through the fellowship of your brothers and sisters in Christ. Today, God serves us. And we're each given a clean slate and clean spiritual bill of health. I once heard a pastor say that a needy God is not a God worth worshiping. That a needy God is not a God at all. God doesn't need your service. He doesn't need your hospitality. He doesn't need your work, but He knows your neighbor does. He knows the people around you do. And so He doesn't desire us to serve Him. He comes to give us good things so that we might serve others. It's only after we bask in the presence of Jesus and receive from Him the good portion that cannot be taken away from you that we can then serve. We're invited by Jesus to serve the anxious and the troubled people of the world, just as Jesus does for us. Just as Jesus did for Martha. To have compassion and mercy on those who are just too wrapped up in doing that they can't see the peace and the presence of Christ who has come for them. So let's continue to be like Mary today, receiving God's gifts through His Word and His sacraments so that we have sustenance to serve the world around us. Not with anxiety and trouble, but with peace, hope, joy that only comes from being served by God Himself.